Hi, Will Gethin here. Welcome to the first episode of Series 2 of the Follow Your Blissters podcast. In this episode, I talk with Dan Millman, legendary teacher of the Peaceful Warrior's Way and author of the cult spiritual classic, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, later screened as the film Peaceful Warrior, and 17 other books which have inspired millions of readers all around the world. In this episode, we explore the extraordinary experiences, wake-up calls, and life lessons that shaped Dan's evolution from childhood dreamer to world-class athlete to international spiritual teacher and best-selling author, as recounted in his new memoir, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, which unveils the real-life journey of the man behind the Peaceful Warrior legend. Enjoy the journey. Hey Dan, great to meet you, finally in audio form at least. We've been in touch variously on email over the years, and this is the first time we get to actually speak. How are you today?
Fine, this feels like an auspicious occasion.
Indeed, it certainly does to me. Are you at home in Brooklyn today?
I am in Brooklyn, New York, and if you hear any sirens in the background, I don't charge extra for the special effects.
Oh, okay. Well, let's hope that there'll be no sirens, especially coming to your home. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled, Dan, to have you as a guest on this podcast. Your first and seminal book, the best-selling book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, which shares your partly autobiographical spiritual journey or metamorphosis from young athlete through to becoming a peaceful warrior, effectively, was a real door opener for me when I first came across it, probably around 1993 or 4, when I was about 23, 24. And while I'd read a couple of Castaneda books by then about his encounters with the legendary shaman Don Juan, which I found really fascinating, but perhaps a little bit far out and not necessarily practical or accessible for my own life, your book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, was the first book I remember that really introduced me to the idea of a spiritual journey in an accessible way. And I was enthralled by your wild man sage character Socrates, the mentor and teacher of the Peaceful Warrior's Way in the book. And I'd say that book was definitely a key inspiration for me undertaking a spiritual journey of my own a few years later when I headed off to India. So in this conversation, we'll be hearing more about your new book as well, mostly, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit. But I'd just love to talk a little bit about The Way of the Peaceful Warrior first.
Sure.
So The Way of the Peaceful Warrior represents Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey Map for Transformational Storytelling, with young Dan, your sort of partly fictional self, following a call to adventure with the meeting with his mentor Socrates to train as a peaceful warrior, which leads him on a road of trials with many challenges as he meets his fears and grows before returning home transformed with an elixir to share with for the benefit of others. And Dan, were you familiar with the hero's journey map when you wrote The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, and did it inform your writing of the story in any way?
Well, I might have come across Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, but it wasn't in the front of my mind when I wrote that. You know, a quotation by Michael Crichton, the author Michael Crichton, comes to mind. He said, "The difference between fiction and life is that fiction has to make sense." And what he meant by that, I believe, was it's about story, the key to story. And to me, Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey and the stages are about stories, literature, movies, film. That's why Chris Vogler wrote that nice book, The Writer's Journey, using Campbell's motif. Whether it applies always to life and every person is a hero and going on their own journey, it's a wonderful way to view one's life. I'm not sure how it fits, but though our lives are stories and they're treasures, because no story on the planet is exactly like yours or mine or anyone's. So our lives are a novel being written, you could say.
Absolutely. Well, I think the sort of hero's journey mythical story arc is kind of in our consciousness anyway, whether you're aware of it or not. So you probably could have written the book with a hero's journey format without even being necessarily specifically aware of Campbell's map to describe it. Yeah. So I know that The Way of the Peaceful Warrior book took initially a few years to find its way in the world, with initial modest sales during the first print run in the early 80s, before eventually going on to become a massive international bestseller and an iconic spiritual classic. When you first published the book, Dan, did you have high hopes for it, or could you have even imagined it to become as successful as it actually has done, selling millions of copies around the world in 29 languages, I believe.
I was new to writing at the time. And it took me 7 years to put something together. I had no idea what it was, but um, I don't want to jump prematurely into the new book, but I do describe 4 mentors in Peaceful Heart Warrior Spirit.
You do,
And
yeah.
I had studied with the first 2 mentors, and they opened doors to insight, and I wanted to share in my own words. I had read Castanet as well, and in a way, people have asked me, did he inspire your work? Well, yes and no. He inspired me to write something more practical, more
Mm.
into everyday, where we could find wisdom in unexpected places, even an old service station, the petrol station. So that when I wrote the book, I had no idea. I thought maybe a few college students would like it because I wrote about my college years. So no, I had no idea that the book would ever be published or make and produce an income or anything like that. There was a pure place. I just wanted to share some insights I'd had in the way that it ended up.
Yeah, it's amazing. Reading your latest book, Peaceful Heart Warrior Spirit, which is obviously your own true life journey, encapsulating all that's in the way of the peaceful warrior, of course, fictionally partly, and beyond. And I was amazed of reading your new book, how the way the peaceful warrior was such a slow burner. Like, I sort of almost imagined this overnight bestseller, but of course it took years to sort of slowly work its way into the world and then really sort of rocket and get bigger and bigger and ripple out to the whole world.
Well, I'm reminded, Will, of a cartoon in the New Yorker magazine. It had an image of a wide chalkboard. Remember the old chalkboards in
Yep.
school? And it had a formula written from the left-hand side all the way across, maybe 15, 20 feet. And it went, this changes to this and becomes this equals this. And it went all the way across. But right in the middle of the formula, someone had erased part of it and written in, then a miracle happens. And that's pretty much my experience with Way of the Peaceful Warrior and many moments in my life. It wasn't formulaic or strategic. It was more improvisational comedy, it feels like.
Which is
Strength.
brilliant.
Yeah.
It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you know, I can actually vividly remember, I mean, a friend had mentioned your book to me, I remember, at the time just before I bought it, and I remember being intrigued, and then I was just walking past a bookshop one day, and I remember seeing that eye-catching picture of the book in the window with the man's body vibrating in light before the backdrop of the service station and the full moon behind it. And I remember immediately being drawn to it and going into the store and buying it. And that does feel like a sort of life-changing moment in a way. And I had so much resonance with that book and sort of real desire and thirst to kind of go on a journey like the one you described.
Well, before my publisher changed the cover to the movie edition of the book when the movie came out in 2006.
Yeah, it's got a
based on
new
my
cover,
first
isn't it?
book.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. And I love the old iconic cover. And there's a brief story behind that. They gave the manuscript to the illustrator, and he actually read it, and he was so inspired he came up with that amazing archetypal image of that figure with the sunrise inside the figure in a night scene around the body. But the person who created that cover, Terry Lamb, also created the image of that other well-known character, Joe Campbell.
Yes.
Of Camel cigarettes, and Terry said it balanced out his karma, so to speak, creating the Peaceful Warrior cover.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Do you know, funny enough, thinking of Socrates, your sort of mystical guru character in the book, when I went to India a few years after reading your book, I was staying in Pune for a while, and I rented a room in this big apartment block building, and next door to me, in the room next door, was this really wild character, an Indian guy with a big wari beard and wild hair, sort of afro hair, naked but for a lungi, and much like sort of reminiscent of your encounters with Socrates originally, or the character who would inspire him, he lured me into his room, and he would sort of rant these mystical musings, staring at me intently with these sort of rapturous eyes. And he reminded me of some ancient Greek philosopher. And I wrote in my diaries at the time, I called him Socrates. And it wasn't until yesterday that, thinking about this conversation, that suddenly occurred to me, of course, that was probably inspired by reading your book, this character Socrates.
Well, that's interesting, Will. In a brief paragraph in the preface of the new book, I state that Socrates is real, Dan Millman is a fictional character. And I also say, just as young Arthur had Merlin, Frodo had Gandalf, Luke Skywalker had Yoda, Daniel San had Mr. Miyagi, and Carlos Castaneda had Don Juan Matus.
That's right.
Mentors and students from life and legend, I had my Socrates.
Yes. But so, yeah, how did maybe just tell our listeners how the creation of Socrates came about. Because he was originally inspired, wasn't he, from your experience of meeting a guy at a service station, and with him you had some discussions about spiritual nature of reality and other things. He really inspired you. I think you write in your book that doors opened in your mind on meeting this character. In fact, would that even have been the call to adventure, do you say, for what your hero's journey?
Well, out of consideration for some listeners who don't really know my work, I might even step back a little bit further and explain the origins of the term peaceful warrior.
Please do, yeah.
I was actually, as I state in the memoir, that I was teaching a course at Oberlin College. I was an assistant professor and in the physical education department. And based on my experiences in the martial arts, I decided to teach a course on Aikido and Tai Chi, both of those. As an introduction to the more flowing martial arts, and I was going to call it in the course catalog the Way of the Warrior, but because they're internal arts, they're not really aggressive arts. They're more flowing and receptive. I decided a light bulb went on, and I went, wait a minute, why don't I call it Way of the Peaceful Warrior? And that's the first time organically I came up with that term. Yeah. And after I'd met this old service station attendant, about 3 a.m, after a late night date, I was walking home, on impulse went into this service station and met this cosmic old guy. He was the night mechanic, but he had many insights he shared. We just got into discussions about life and death and the cosmos. And I remembered that. He did inspire an epic poem I wrote. I don't even have it anymore, but it was 50 years ago or more. But I was inspired, and when it came time to write a book, there was something I wanted to share. I'd always been very much into self-improvement. I took memory courses in speed reading, and I learned sleight of hand and ventriloquism and various acrobatic arts and martial arts. But one day, it struck me that no matter how much I improved myself, only one person benefited. But if I could help other people, if I could somehow influence other people in a positive way, I had no idea how at the time, then it made my life more meaningful. And that's when I had the urge to begin writing. And again, it took shape gradually. And I went, I don't know how to write a book, so maybe I just write about my life and weave some other elements in. And I remembered this old service station attendant, and he became the source, the mentor. And it's not just a technique I used as a writer. That sounds too conscious. It was more a loving impulse on my part. But I don't know, as Dan Millman at the time, whether I could have expressed the wisdom with as much humor and insight as I could have as my character. But inventing a muse, in creating this character, through him I was able to step outside myself, beyond myself, and express what was in that original book.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a very such a strong way to tell the story through this really colourful, eccentric character. And I remember you describing in your new book, Peaceful Heart, Spiritual. Spirit. What's it again? Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit. You describe how the publishers originally, because you originally just only mentioned your meeting with the night mechanic in the book, and then the publisher came back to you and said, we actually want to hear more about this character. So out of that grew a new draft with this embellished character who then informed a huge part of the book and as your mentor. And I can imagine that must have made it such a more vivid and interesting book as a result. Yeah.
I don't know how I did it, actually. I've had that experience many times writing. Characters who don't exist in the morning are fleshed out by the late afternoon. Um, but yes, it was a 20-hour a day. I barely slept, immersion for almost a week. I would write late into the night, early morning, then go to sleep for a few hours, get up and write again. It was a 2-week rewrite, and that transformed the book and transformed my life eventually.
Yeah, absolutely.
And in a way, that was the call to the adventure, the call to adventure on that journey we all
Yeah,
take.
so Campbell said the call is like a phone ringing, calling you to make the journey, and it comes back till you answer the call. So what do you feel would be the defining moment then to begin the journey? Would it have been the initial meeting with what would become Socrates, or the internal impulse to start writing the book?
Well, I again, like many young people, even writing a 10-page paper in school was intimidating, daunting. So I hadn't really thought about writing a book, but I had done a series of articles on gymnastics, which was my area of expertise at the time. And the stack grew of a series of articles. It got higher and higher. And I looked at it one day, and another light bulb moment. It was, wow, that almost looks like a manuscript of a book. And that's the first time I really thought about writing a full book. And it went through many shape shifting moments over a 7-year period, the first book, until finally it was, I thought, ready to submit to a publisher. I sent it to a bunch of publishers. They sent it back unopened because they said, we don't accept books except through a literary agent. I didn't know what a literary agent was. So again, I was just learning the ropes, kind of like Candide, stumbling through toward the light. And things seem to have worked out.
Yeah. So Dan, could we just pinpoint, like, for the sake of sort of starting the journey, as it were, when the call was it the actual call to write the book, would you say?
No, I think it was what I described previously about
Meeting.
realizing that it was really that impulse that I wanted to share with
Yeah.
others.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
I believe people have asked me, how come you met these four amazing teachers,
Yeah.
Dan? And it wasn't because I was more deserving or anything like that. It was, I believe, it was out of that impulse, my commitment to share whatever I learned with other people. It was that call to teaching.
Yeah.
Not everybody is called to be a teacher, but I was early on. I wouldn't have used those words, but I wanted to share, and that out of that impulse, came the first book. But I didn't write a book after Way of the Peaceful Warrior for 10 years because I wrote what I had to say, and I was content with that.
Yeah.
But when I met the third of the four mentors in my new book that I described, the man I call the warrior priest, that inspired me, gave me new insights to start writing. And then it was almost a book a year.
Yes.
And it only took 40 years
Yeah.
to write the 18
Yes.
books.
Okay. Well, we'll come onto that bit a little bit further in. Let's
Sure.
just rewind the clock a little bit, Dan. Just give a sense of how your childhood developed and led you onto this journey, because of course you started off with a sort of penchant for daredevil stunts and then doing martial arts and gymnastics as you described. How did you? And of course you then became a champion gymnast. How did that come about? Just give a brief synopsis of your sort of emergence as a champion gymnast, which set the scene for you to develop then from there towards a life of meaning.
Of course. You've probably heard the saying that we can only understand life looking backwards, but we have to live it forwards. So at the time, I didn't connect anything up to my future. I just followed my nose and my instincts. And as a young boy, I discovered, well, first of all, it started in kindergarten when I was the youngest in my class. My mother liked to work out in the world, and so she got me into school very early. I was always the youngest child in class, first grade, second, and so on. every level. I was the youngest, and also I was small in stature, which was great for gymnastics, not so much for basketball. So I talked too much, a lifelong habit, I believe, um, and it attracted the attention of some bullies. And so I finally, after being bullied and threatened and punched and so on, like many children, I decided to ask my father to teach me about self-defense. And he took me to a boxing gym where I discovered very rather quickly um, that I didn't like hitting other people or getting hit. So I moved on to judo, which was the word means the gentle way, where where I could throw larger people using leverage and so on, and that led to a lifelong interest in martial arts, to karate, and to other forms of martial arts, which developed kind of that initial warrior impulse, the sense of being strong and growing into my manhood, around puberty and so on, through adolescence. But also, there was a parallel line, which was I discovered an old trampoline and discovered I loved jumping up and down on a trampoline, which many people can relate to today. There are trampolines everywhere, in the backyards and so on. But I had no idea, Will, that jumping up and down would lead to a scholarship to college, a gymnastics career, a world championship, and all that followed. I just had no conception. I'd be teaching at Stanford University, uh, through that initial impulse that I loved to play like the acrobat and flip and somersault. And again, even then, I wouldn't have predicted that I would have gone from creating talent for sports into the arena of talent for living. That contemplation, what skill sets can prepare us better for life?
Thinking about it, I guess it kind of makes sense in a way that the appeal of your book may be partly this sort of perhaps quite unique synthesis of someone who's actually lived a warrior life in the sense of a gymnastics, physical mobility, etc., combined then with this sort of spiritual, deeper search for life and the wisdom that came with that. So it's like that kind of synthesis of those two elements, I guess, makes the Peaceful Warrior very, very compelling.
I'd like to point out that athletes, um, there aren't any dumb athletes that I've seen. There are athletes who are not academically motivated, who don't spend as much time, they don't find as meaningful doing abstract studies and abstract
Yeah.
thinking. But if someone is a coordinated athlete, their nervous system becomes quite
Yes.
intelligent. We have emotional intelligence, we also have kinesthetic intelligence. And so the nervous system is connected to the brain, of course, so it's all one unit. And what I didn't realize is that athletics, in my case, gymnastics, was the beginning of my very real spiritual training.
Yes.
I learned about being in the zone and the flow and meditation, meditative movement. I tell the story in the memoir how a coach, when I started coaching the gymnasts at Stanford University, uh, a coach from USC in Southern California brought his team up to compete with ours, and he whispered to me in an aside. He said, "Dan, I heard this strange rumor that you have your gymnasts meditate before competitions." And I went, "No, of course not. I wouldn't do that. I have them meditate during competitions." He didn't really get it, but I certainly did by that time, that training and performing was a form of meditation. You have to be in the moment and so
But
on. So that was the beginning of my spiritual training, even though I never would have used that word.
yes, but would you say you were quite ahead of the curve though? Because I doubt many people were teaching
Right.
physical, athletic sports and things and meditation at that time, were they? That combination. Yeah.
Agreed. No, that was a fringe
Yeah.
activity at the time. This is before yoga exploded
Yeah.
and meditation. But yes, this was unusual just for outliers at
Yeah.
the time.
So we had the call to adventure, which was with your impulse to share with others and the call to teach. And then when we start the journey, or a character or protagonist starts the journey, they cross the threshold to take up the journey, the road of adventure. And crossing the threshold to begin the journey is symbolized very potently in the tarot with the picture of the fool on the tarot card, the swashbuckling character with a
Yes.
knapsack on his back, standing on the edge of the cliff, ready to take the leap into the unknown. And in your case, Dan, being the more athletic um, uh, figure, perhaps preparing to do a triple backflip into the unknown. um, but yeah, C.G. Jung, whose in-depth psychology form the foundations of the hero's journey, which Joseph Campbell later built on, called the fool the precursor to the saviour. And by this he meant that the willingness to be a fool is the precursor to transformation. And it's the idea that you can't really move forwards with a new goal or new venture unless you're prepared to take a risk of making a fool of yourself. So we have to sort of, prepare to take the risks, to make mistakes, to grow. Has that been your experience, Dan, that you've had to be prepared to be a fool to learn on the path?
Oh, yes. And I give incidents in the book, even in my later years, where Socrates, the character, once said to me, "We're all fools. Just some of us know it, others don't." And there's the archetype of the wise fool as well. Now, in the tarot, the fool card actually is the innocent beginning the journey, blinded by the sun, looking up toward the sun and about to step off a precipice. And that's what it felt like. I use the image of going down a river and heading toward the white water. Everything's calm, and then suddenly the boat starts moving more quickly. And I really met that more than once in my life. Various challenges. As you know, I start the book literally up in the air and upside
That's
down
right.
at the World
Yep.
Championships, at Royal Albert Hall, London. So I have good associations with London and the UK in general.
Yeah, I'm just remembering you say in the book there's a part in sometime in your childhood or early adolescence where you were told jump by somebody, and you learned just to jump without thinking into things. Yeah.
Well, that was the moment when I was following my 9-year-old streetwise school friends. I was 6 at the time. And they climbed a house under construction. There was a sand pile about 20 feet below. And they were jumping off, and I wanted to so badly. How many of us have had that experience? We want to do something, but we're afraid.
Yeah.
And I kept stepping back and stepping forward. And finally, Steve, you saw one of my earlier role models and mentors in childhood. He yelled, "Yeah, Danny, just stop thinking about it. Jump." And that made sense to me. And that became a meme or a mission statement for me, probably through the oncoming years. Just stop thinking and jump.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of doing a bungee jump once in South Africa, which they were billing as the highest in the world. I'm not sure that's even true, but you're standing on the top of this extraordinary precipice, and you think, how on earth am I going to actually jump off that? And who knows what in you stirs, but something eventually makes you just go for it, and you just do it. Yeah, even though you might be going to your death, or it feels like it.
Right, I can relate.
Yeah. So taking up the road to adventure and committing to the journey, following the call to adventure, the hero on a mythical quest will start to learn new skills and develop themselves. And in your case, you were a peaceful warrior in training, and your book details, as you've mentioned, the many fascinating mentors and trainings that you experienced along the way. And you mentioned, just as in the mythical stories and films, there are various mentors like Gandalf to Frodo and Merlin to Arthur. You had 4 mentors who were instrumental in training you on your journey. And you refer to them respectively as the professor, the guru, the warrior priest, and the sage. What were the most important tools you learnt from these mentors along the way? Let's say for now, during the early formative stages. So maybe a couple of examples of really powerful lessons you learned along the way from these mentors, or 2 of them.
Let me emphasize that because of that commitment I mentioned before to share what I learned through apparent coincidences or synchronicities, a phone call from someone, for example, or stumbling across something. That's how I found each mentor in line. And this was over a 20-year period.
Yes.
I wasn't a spiritual vagabond just collecting initiations from various teachers. And the professor, these are all radically different teachers. And I probably need to also, to provide context, I need to say that I didn't presume in writing this memoir, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, I didn't presume that everyone, legions of people were going to want to read about this Dan Millman character. I'm not a celebrity. However, The book is more about the spiritual quest. And I believe we're all on that hero's journey. We're all on a spiritual quest, whether or not we would use that term.
Yeah.
We're all seeking fulfillment. We're seeking satisfaction, meaning in life, and purpose. We all do. We share that. We're different paths up the same mountain, let's
Yeah.
say. And so the professor represents the technological approach to enlightenment. And that's what he promised, illumination in a 40-day intensive training, 10 hours a day for 40 days. How many of us have time for that today? But back in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, I was able to, through, again, a series of coincidences and circumstances, make time to do that training. And we've all heard of trainings like EST and Avatar, and there's so many LifeSpring, so many methods and systems where you do exercises and find your way to more clarity and so on. And so that's what the professor represented. And I learned a global heritage of spiritual traditions through his own unique background that I describe in the book. I was able to go into this in-depth training. People who've heard of the Enneagram materials in the best-selling books, that came from the professor. People say, no, it was from the Jesuits, the Sufis, or Claudio Naranjo, Helen Palmer, but they all sourced it to the man I called Oscar Ichazo. Well, that's his name, but I called him the professor. So that's what he represented, the technological, hard work-based approach to enlightenment. The guru, entirely different. He said, I'd rather beat you with a stick than tell you to meditate your way to enlightenment. He had a more radical approach. And presumably, he stated very clearly, and there was considerable evidence at the time that attracted teachers like Ken Wilber and Alan Watts, teachers and authors who were amazed by this particular guru. He was transparent to the divine. In other words, he transmitted divine illumination through just sitting
Actually,
with
might be worth mentioning at this stage for any listeners that might know of the guru. He was known variously, wasn't he? His various different names, from Franklin Jones to Adi Dar, Bubba Free John, Dar Free John, and probably various others as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. And he had a worldwide following at the time. And he did have the mojo. I will say that. He really was quite powerful, creative, hilariously funny at times. Yeah. But one of the themes that I repeat in the new book is that all teachers are human beings, and all humans have flaws and foibles and frailties.
Absolutely.
And we often like to project perfection, divine perfection. In fact, it was the guru who made clear that there are three approaches to spiritual life. They correspond to the three phases of human life: childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, or presumed maturity. And in the childhood of our seeking, what do children need? What do they seek? They seek an all-powerful parent figure to tell them how to live, to set restrictions in their life, to guide them, to put their trust in. And that's what people who follow gurus and authority figures often do. They have a childlike approach. There is nothing wrong with that, but it does represent the beginnings of our spiritual journey. There's nothing wrong with childhood, but we need to eventually mature through the difficult phase of adolescence. We're seeing many people today who are taking up that adolescent role, that I am my own authority. Only I know what's best for me. All these teachers and authority figures are fakes and charlatans. And that's the adolescent approach. So they kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and they reject wisdom, and they miss a lot. Because naturally, during adolescence, we need to find our own values, not just what we've been taught as a child. But then eventually, hopefully, we mature to adulthood, where we find wisdom wherever it may appear, even in an old service station. We learn from trees bending in the wind, clouds drifting across the sky. And so the guru actually presented this to us, which was unusual, because many guru types are only too happy to welcome childlike devotees who want to surrender to them and worship them. Whereas he said, I want mature practitioners. So that's a sample of one of his many teachings that I do share in abbreviated form in the new book.
Yes.
And I could go on, but after these two teachers, and by the way, I was studying in the Guru's community, living in a community household, living that way of
Yeah.
life, moment to moment, for almost 8
Yeah.
years. And after that, that's when doors opened inside me and the impulse to write a book, which ended up Way of the Peaceful Warrior.
Exactly. Hi, this is Will here again. That bell was just to alert you that we're going to take a quick break so I can tell you about the different ways to listen to and engage with this podcast. I really hope you're enjoying this episode. For Series 2, I'm releasing episodes monthly on Wednesdays on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and all major podcast channels where you also can subscribe. Any ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts would be greatly appreciated, as they really help to let others know about Follow Your Blisters. And don't forget, we're spelling blisters with a double S on the bliss. To find out more about this podcast and the hero's journey, please head to my website, consciousfrontiers.com, where you can sign up to the monthly newsletter for news and updates and follow our social channels. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the journey. Well, listen, I'm sure we're going to pick up on more of these mentors and the influence they had, particularly the next two as well, the warrior priest, Michael Bookbinder, and then the sage, David K. Reynolds. But just to rewind the clock a little bit, I remember actually in your book you described how LSD you described it as marking the, I quote, conscious beginning of your search for illumination. And I wonder how helpful and illuminating you found that experience, which I know you prepared for weeks and took it very seriously and mindfully. How useful was that experience for you?
Many authors, sages, and teachers today are coming out, so to speak, and talking more about an LSD experience or the benefits they encountered. I was a pretty straight-laced young guy. And so it wouldn't have really occurred to me to use psychedelics in growing up. I grew up, I was born in 1946. I grew up through the 50s, time of innocence and denial and all sorts of things. But finally, there were the 60s. And I was going to UC Berkeley in California, kind of a center for the human potential movement later, but also political activism and so on. And after my leg was shattered in a motorcycle crash, which I describe in the book, the original Peaceful Warrior book, in the movie, it's depicted, and it really did happen. I describe it in the new book as well, more accurately. And that shook me up. I'm pointing upward right now. I started asking bigger questions about life. That, in a way, was one of the dark nights of the soul.
Certainly was the dark night within the Way of the Peaceful Warrior sort of framework, wasn't it? Yeah. Exactly.
And that did send me onward into what is life really about. I went from that bulletproof age in the 20s, the 20-somethings, or I can do anything. And I started getting more reflective and quieter. And then I started wondering, what's the inner world like? I read about accounts in various books, and that's when it struck me, I think I might want to experiment with this LSD stuff. And I found someone who had a tab of righteous Owsley, window pane, whatever it was, LSD. And I did it in the proper setting, in a safe space, among a couple of friends. So when I did do that journey, for me, it was a death and rebirth of the ego, so to speak. The psychedelic experience, which I read in preparation. So I prepared well, and that's why I'm making a point of this, because I don't want to seem like I'm endorsing a blanket testimonial, go out and grab some LSD or other psychedelics. We don't know whether they're pure these days and so on.
And they're not always right for everybody.
But for me, no, they're not always right for everybody. Nothing is. So, but for me at the time, it was the profound experience, a preview of possibilities. And so it did influence even some of the writing I did in Way of the Peaceful Warrior. Some of the cosmic journeys I went on in that book were influenced by that LSD experience. And I probably should add that I took it.
I was very interested.
Several years.
I was very interested to read that, by the way. Yeah, just because I remember all these sort of very vivid, sort of slightly altered state scenes in The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. And yeah, it was very interesting to know that they've been inspired by the LSD. Yeah, when I read it in your new
Yes,
book. Yeah.
yes. But the second time, and the only other
Mm,
time I took LSD, it was pretty much a waste of my time. Many people try to go back and recapture the first
mm.
time uh, they do anything, but there's only one first time. And that time it was sort of, yeah, hallucinating and so on, but really it wasn't anything like the first time. And I've always for myself, I don't tell other people what to do. That's not my goal. But for myself, I've never wanted to use recreational drugs. To me, they're entheogens. They're profound ways to connect with a deeper part of ourselves. So I did it in a respectful way, not just a casual use.
Much the best way, yeah. I think I did far too much of the casual in my earlier days, but yeah, I think that's by far the best way to do it. I think Aldous Huxley recommended, well, not recommended, but I think he did LSD 6 times in his life, if I remember rightly.
Hmm. Yeah.
But actually, weirdly enough, I remember being in Thailand when I was about 18, and I was with some friends, and we bumped into a guy from Berkeley, California, who was about 27 at the time, and he said, "You guys should try these magic mushrooms." And he said, "Yeah, Aldous Huxley recommended that if you have a child, when he gets to the age of about 10, take him up the top of the mountain and give him some magic mushrooms, and he'll be made for life." Huxley, and we, sure enough, we then took this magic mushroom omelette the following night, which took very innocently, thinking it was just some sort of some little sort of travel gimmick, and wow, did that blow our minds? But yeah, powerful stuff. Anyway, so sometimes heroes or heroines will receive divine or unseen assistance on their journeys, as with the Force in Star Wars, which was the first film to consciously apply the hero's journey framework. And Campbell, along with a number of other interesting thinkers, including the German philosopher Goethe, have shared this idea that when we follow our authentic call and truly commit to it, invisible forces seem to come to our aid. Campbell said, "Follow your bliss and the universe will open doors where before there were only walls." Have you experienced this sense of benevolent unseen forces or magical assistance coming to your aid when you follow this call or any other call?
Many people imagine they're all this benign type forces that come to your aid, but a motorcycle crash can also be an intervention, a divine
Definitely, yeah.
intervention that doesn't feel very pleasant at the time, but can turn a life around. Um, we don't need to look for adversity in life. It's part of and parcel of everyday life, sometimes small, sometimes larger. Um, but yes, I do have a sense of that. Some people metaphysically interpret such things as inner guides and master healers, but I think it's important to stay open to help where it may appear, and we've all heard the cliche, the saying that when the student is ready, the teacher
Yeah.
appears. But I believe many people misinterpret that. They think when they're somehow deserving enough, or they've suffered enough, or prepared well enough, then a teacher like Socrates, or Don Juan, or Gandalf will appear in their life to guide them or kick them up the path. I view it a slightly different way. When the student is ready or paying attention, that's when these subtle forces and people enter your life. And we've all had moments like this. There's that saying, when the universe calls, better pick up the phone.
Yeah, as you say, that those moments can not necessarily be the sort of benevolent, wise, loving guru, but maybe a big kick up the arse in some way from the universe with some sort of nasty shock or an accident or whatever it might be to wake you up and make you see the error of your ways and get going into something more positive.
Midlife
Crisis.
crises can become mid-course correction.
Yeah, exactly. And crisis, of course, meaning opportunity in Chinese,
Yes,
or both,
yes,
crisis and
exactly.
opportunity. Yeah.
Right.
So writing, of course, has been a key part of your journey. And talking of unseen forces, you explain in your new book how Socrates was like a muse to you. Would he be the muse that you channel? Would you channel Socrates as your muse when you actually write your books?
Well, I think many people have heard of channeled works, a supposed 20,000-year-old discarnate entity from another dimension. Someone opens their mouth and they channel this being
Yeah, I
through.
don't mean in
And
that
the
way. Yeah.
idea of
Mhm.
oh
Yeah.
no, no, that's
Yeah. Yeah.
okay
Yeah.
though, because the word channeling does refer sometimes to people who claim to be channeling other
Yeah.
entities who are wiser than them.
Yeah.
Now, in my own view, such entities are part of them. They're a part of their psyche. But it's a way for them to bring more wisdom into the world than their personality level, could access. So, in a sense, Socrates, as I mentioned before, performed that function for me. Um, and who knows what influences are out there or in here. But we need to be at least open to the possibility that whether we interpret it, you know how some people say, I caught a cold when they get a virus, and other people say, I'm having a cleansing
Yeah.
crisis. You know, metaphysicians interpret reality in maybe a more dramatic way, things that can't be proven or disproven, which brings us to the warrior priest, who was a metaphysical healer. And many of the statements he made and things he taught could not be proven or disproven, but they were quite interesting, intriguing, speculative areas that I found uh, opened different possibilities. For example, he spoke about the three selves, and it's from the Hawaiian kahunas, the Huna teachings. Um, they talk about the not just the conscious self, which we call the ego or the personality level or the conscious mind, uh, which is here to learn about life. But then there's the higher self. Many people have spoken of that in a metaphorical or poetic way without really understanding its function. And then there's the basic self, quite important, which many of us refer to as the subconscious mind. But that would be for a whole other seminar. I just wanted to mention those three selves, which were one of the
Yeah.
contributions of the warrior priest, which stimulated my first book after Way of the Peaceful Warrior, to convey clearly to readers how those three selves function in each one of us.
This stage is also about facing and overcoming challenges, and Campbell, of course, later updated his mantra for living, "Follow your bliss," to "Follow your blisters," to reflect the real grit that comes from following a true calling in your life. Can you comment, Dan, on the role challenges or blisters have played in helping you grow on the road to bliss?
Well, for me, the way I interpret it in everyday terms are an appreciation for adversity. Um,
Nice.
you know, it's if we agree on everything, only one of us is necessary. It's fine for people to disagree, have a different perspective or interpretation, but I think we can agree that we've all gone through some difficulties, challenges, a form of adversity, physical, emotional, or mental pain in our life. And yet, if we look back on those times, we can we'd have to acknowledge that we're a little bit wiser, maybe a little bit stronger for having gone through that. Sometimes digging out of a dark hole can give us the strength to climb the mountain.
Absolutely.
So we need to have a thread of appreciation for adversity. We don't have to pretend to like it when it comes. It's not usually pleasant, but we do emerge stronger and wiser with an expanded perspective. So that's why I can appreciate those challenges, and I do describe them obviously along the way in my relationships. My first marriage, I was married very young, and I go through that, and that's one of the reasons I left the professor, because all these techniques I was learning weren't actually applied. They made me better at doing inner work, but the inner work was kind of separate and distinct in many ways from the challenges of relationships, career decisions, and so forth. There was like a firewall between the inner work and actual daily life.
Yes, absolutely. Um, Often the biggest challenges people meet on a hero's journey is their actual own fear, be it a fear of failing or going out of your comfort zone, or fear of facing your demons as they arise along the way. And I've got a couple of questions here relating to fear. On your journey to becoming a peaceful warrior and teacher of the peaceful warrior's way, when have you been held back by fear? If you have, of course.
Well, I was, first of all, my gymnastics training. See, gymnastics is one of the warrior sports. One tennis is a wonderful game, or golf, but usually it's rare that your life is in jeopardy playing tennis or golf. Um, but doing gymnastics or skydiving, bungee jumping, well, bungee jumping's not necessarily dangerous. It's scary, but there are certain sports such as like free climbing, rock climbing, wingsuits, base jumping, those sorts of things. Your body is actually on the line. And because in training in gymnastics, I didn't use a lot of safety belts. It was more careful progressions. But any day I walked into the gym, there was the risk of being paralyzed or dying.
Yeah.
It's happened. So because of that, fear became an old friend of mine. I interpreted it differently. To me, fear and excitement, the only difference between them was whether I was breathing. So I was used to facing fear. I used to crash 50 times a day. I was used to failure. I failed and failed and failed until I succeeded. And that was just the process for
Yeah.
me. So that was, again, part of my own particular training. Other people have faced that in learning a musical instrument or a new language. There are all kinds of different approaches we take. Again, those different paths up the mountain. So it wasn't just, one doesn't have to do gymnastics. But there was a wonderful quotation by a boxing coach named Cus D'Amato who said, heroes and cowards feel the same fear. They just respond
Mm.
differently. And so I learned to respond in a particular way. First of all, stop thinking and jump. And so in my seminars, I go into more, when do you listen to fear? Because it's a wonderful servant, but it's a terrible master, as many of us have heard. So when the fear is objective, if we can be injured or killed, then we need to, maybe the fear can guide us to prepare better, to take precautions, even to avoid a situation that maybe we're not ready to face, perhaps. But if the fear is subjective, if we're afraid of being embarrassed, looking foolish, um, shame, and so on, that's when I say cut through it with a warrior's sword and go for it. It doesn't break bones. You'll get over it. So you're embarrassed. So you look like a fool. I've looked like a fool many times. And those of us who are willing to look like fools usually learn
Yeah.
more and
Yeah.
achieve more.
Robin Sharma, who's the author Robin Sharma, who's one of the talking heads on the Finding Joe documentary about the hero's journey. He talks about courage, Jim, which is the idea of basically consistently going up to your fears and going past them on a regular basis, so your comfort zone expands each time you do, and you don't get so overwhelmed by your fears. So yeah, it's that kind of idea. I've also heard successful writers and other successful people talk about having had a real fear of being successful or becoming successful, that if they do reach the top of the mountain, they risk becoming estranged from friends and family and all they know, and perhaps people envying them and just feeling very sort of estranged and not very safe. Were you ever fearful of success along the way, Dan?
Not consciously, but there is that moment where do you want to go for it, or would you rather step back into safer territory? Because there is a risk involved. And the biggest risk is, what if I succeed and I'm still not happy? Whereas if we don't really try, then the rest of our life we can go, well, if I'd really tried, I probably would have grabbed the brass ring, reached my goals. If I'd really tried, I know I would have done it. So by actually giving it our best effort and being willing to fail, that is so the fear of failure and fear of success are blended together in many ways. Barbara Rasp, a wonderful writer, said, the lesson is simple, the student is complicated. And we complicate our approaches to food, to sex, and to fear, success and failure in life. And basically, if we just have a kind of go for it and see what happens. It's based on the realization that I learned along the way with the four mentors that we can't control the outcomes in life. We can't control whether we sink a putt, find love, or succeed in business. However, we can control our efforts. And by making a good effort over time, we vastly increase the odds of reaching that goal over not making the
Yeah.
effort. And that's something I learned from the sage, to at least bring Dr. Reynolds in to the
Yeah.
discussion. Uh, yeah, a realistic, simple approach based on what we do moment to
Great.
moment.
Yeah, I'm sort of looking at the clock and realizing we're sort of running out of time. I've got lots more to ask you, so I'm going to sort of rattle through a bit. But yeah, so if we move into the dark wood stage of the journey, which of course is when the character in the stories or the protagonist meets their greatest fear or obstacle. What do you think, Dan, was the biggest fear you had to overcome on your own journey in able to progress on your path?
Well, it felt more like a dark cloud than a fear. There was a point in life where I was newly divorced from my first wife. It was a failed marriage. I really tried. It was almost 8 years. Um, and it finally imploded. And at the same time, I wrote Way of the Peaceful Warrior after that, and the book failed.
Or
It
seem
sold
to,
a
yeah,
few thousand. Well, it seemed to, but it
yeah,
did. It absolutely
yeah.
failed. Um, it was out of print, and they declined to print a paperback
Their
version.
loss, eh?
So, well, yes, had reason to regret it later on, but who knew what would happen? But those times, it wasn't so much fear, but it was a dark time. It was that dark night of the soul. I tried this, and the doors closed. I tried that, and the doors closed. I was alone, and I didn't know what I was going to do from there. And I expressed that uh, 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 from truth and fiction mixed in my first book, Way of the Peaceful
Mm.
Warrior, but more accurately, of course, in the true
Yes, you
story,
do, yeah.
in the new memoir. Yeah.
This stage is also about meeting the shadow, and it's often by going into the dark that we find our treasure. As Jung said, we don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, by making the darkness conscious. And I wonder, how important have you found shadow work or illuminating the darker depths of yourself, say, for progressing on your path as a spiritual warrior? And can you perhaps share an example if one comes to mind?
Yes, and let me just say the context of peaceful heart warrior spirit. I believe that we're all peaceful warriors in training, because everyone is seeking to live with a peaceful heart, a sense of serenity, equanimity in the chaos and change of everyday life. But at the same time, we need a warrior spirit. And it takes that warrior spirit, the willingness to stand up tall inside of ourselves, roll up our sleeves and march into life, that allowed me to go into that shadow work first with a professor, where we did group processing and dealt with some of the dark aspects, things we had done that we're not proud of, going into that group process and really seeing ourselves realistically rather than through self-image, which tends to be brighter
Yeah.
than our reality. So I started fairly young. Also, even the LSD trip was a confrontation with my shadow. But it was really refined and accelerated and amplified in my work with the sage, because part of his work is doing something called Nikon, which is inward looking in Japanese. And it's a deep self examination of three questions in relation to other people, which is, what have I received from them? All they've given me. What have I given back? Which tends to be usually less. And finally, what troubles or difficulties have I caused them? Now, most people don't really want to contemplate that with other people. But that's when I really got into the shadow work in a way that was more effective than many other avenues, such as dream work, Gestalt therapy, or other ways to view oneself realistically.
Mm.
And that's where the sage was quite helpful in
Yes,
humanizing.
definitely. So the stage is also about death and rebirth. What part of Dan needed to die, would you say, in this Darkwood stage in order for you to move forward on your quest?
Well, that brings up a larger and important issue of what we call the ego, which gets a bad rap, the term ego. Freud meant it neutrally. It just was ich. It was just I, the organizing principle of experience. Freud didn't see it as a pejorative term at all. But today, with our psychological and spiritual sophistication, in the old days, we used to say, um, I'm talking about ancient times, if people misbehaved, they said, the devil made me do it. And today we go, oh no, my ego made me do it, as if it's a separate part of
Yeah.
ourselves, something that must be gotten rid of. But the ego is the conscious self. I'm not trying to get rid of my ego, I'm trying to transcend it. That's the whole goal. And I went through a number of dark nights of the soul, confrontations with this self, uh, and first in the LSD trip, profound. It was a sense of ego death. And after that, I emerged in a rebirth as I came out of this LSD journey, where how did that manifest? Very simply, I didn't take this Dan Millman character quite as seriously anymore. I wasn't quite as ready to defend him and his strategies. And this was accelerated in the training with the professor, his Arica school, Arica. Um, so I actually had a number of confrontations. How many of us, through a relationship difficulty, have seen parts of ourselves we aren't too crazy
Yeah,
about?
for sure.
Many people relate to that. And so in my difficulties with my first wife, I started seeing that, I once imagined myself a knight in shining armor on this hero's journey, and that armor became tarnished and rusted in how seeing my immaturity, my self-absorption, um, going through that relationship. So again, I've gone through the dark night of the soul and seen my shadow in many different
Yeah, I
circumstances.
think many of us, certainly myself, sort of start off go on a spiritual journey with sort of a naive assumption they're sort of heading for this wonderful sort of journey of towards light with sort of beautiful experiences, and little do they know that you actually got to really go through the dark, difficult stuff to actually move forward in any way.
Exactly.
Campbell said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." What treasure, Dan, do you think you found or extracted from the dark wood of your journey?
That is perhaps the most challenging question, because we imagine a treasure as something glittering
Yeah.
and valuable and rare and shiny. I had the image of a little piece of wood I found in a forest that was unusual shape, or the wind through the trees are a treasure. So it came back for me, the treasure was a simpler life uh, of acceptance, self acceptance, respect for my own process that I started learning with the warrior priest who called himself a cheerleader to the soul,
Yes.
and also work with the sage. Uh, so the treasure was daily life. I people some people might assume, just hearing this, that, oh, Dan studied with these four mentors and now he parrots their words in his own language. But actually, it doesn't work like that. I couldn't duplicate the work or the background of the professor, his immense background in school. It has to be done within the context of his school. And I don't manifest or as a guru who transmits the divine by just sitting with me. Um, so each of these teachers were unique, but what they did was they opened doors of
Yeah.
insight that helped me to share an approach to living I call the Peaceful Warrior's Way, with basic tenets. For example, there is no best teacher, no best book, no best diet, no best religion, no best martial art. There's only the best for each of us at a given time of our life. So this respect for your process and other people's process and my own, I believe, is part of that treasure I took away.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. And that brings us neatly into the return stage of the journey. At the end of the hero's journey stories, the hero or heroine returns home stronger and wiser with an elixir from the journey to share, something to share for the greater good of the community back home, and in your case, arguably the wider global community. And I would suggest that your elixir was the peaceful warrior's way, all the wisdom that you'd accrued on your journey, which you continue to share as an evolved teacher in your numerous books and warrior's way trainings that followed to a growing audience around the world. Your 19...
Yes.
Yeah, you agree with that?
Yes.
Your 19 books have included the Peaceful Warrior Saga, and that includes, following on from the first book, The Way of the Peaceful Warrior, includes The Sacred Journey of the Peaceful Warrior, which I also really enjoyed when I was in my 20s. There was The Hidden School, and then The Journey of Socrates, which I'm really intrigued to read. Of course, all these stories of finding the treasure are, of course, the treasure as well. And so I suggest that the return stage of your journey is also, towards writing this book, is also about sharing the essence of your journey. And yeah, just to touch briefly on the journey of Socrates, that book sounds fascinating. The story of your iconic mentor, who I see you've called Sergei Ivanov Socrates, which begins with his early life as an orphan child in Tsarist Russia, and his journey to becoming a peaceful warrior, who would go on to mentor the character Dan in The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. Can you give listeners a little taste of what that book has in store and what readers might take away from it?
It's probably my best written book.
Is it?
I wanted to see if I could. Yes, I think it is. Most people, in fact, somebody gave me the sideways compliment because, again, Way of the Peaceful Warrior was my first book. I was learning and honing my craft, just starting out. And when they read The Journeys of Socrates 25 years later, they said, Dan, I can't believe the same person wrote both these books, because they were talking about the quality of the writing. And I wanted, many self-help writers like me who want to write a novelistic type book, it's usually fairly rudimentary, but it's a way to convey information and teachings, as I did in Way of the Peaceful Warrior. No one would call it a literary masterpiece, though it does have some redeeming content. Whereas The Journeys of Socrates was a novel that I really called upon the best I could in me. I worked long and hard at it, and I wanted to convey the type of life that might have created and shaped a man like the old gas station fellow I met, who was the archetypal teacher that many people have read and loved. I had been studying a Russian martial art called Sistema, and I went to Lake Ladoga and the Valam, the monastery island that I describe in that novel. But I actually went with a Russian martial arts group, and that inspired me to make the location of Socrates' life, being a child born in Russia who later immigrates to the U.S. And that's where that book was inspired by it. Every book has its own, creation story.
Great. Well, I'm definitely going to read that one. That sounds most intriguing. In Peaceful Heart Warrior Spirit, you describe how your fourth and last mentor, you write about the sage, brought you more focus onto attaining and teaching skills that you can use in everyday life. And you'd become an expert in a work, but still hadn't mastered some aspects of living effectively in the world. So with the sage's help, you found a way to live with what you describe as living with your head in the clouds and your feet on the ground, which was also the inspiration for the title of this book, Peaceful Heart Warrior Spirit. Can you expand down on what it means to live with your head in the clouds and feet on the ground, and how your latest teachings reflect this?
Well, I suppose I can convey that with a true story, an incident that happened. There was a man who approached me decades ago who had read Way of the Peaceful Warrior and said, Dan, I'm really interested in spiritual life now and spiritual practice now that I've read your book, but how can I make the time? I have a wife and 3 children and a full-time job. And he came to understand, as I do now, that his wife, his children, and his work in the world were his primary spiritual practices.
Yeah.
They demand more and develop more than going and sitting in a cave somewhere and meditating. And I know this because I've done both. And so daily life becomes our arena of personal evolution. Daily life is guaranteed to teach us, through the challenges we meet, all that we need to evolve as human beings if we're paying attention. And so that's And the sage. Now, I had started this with a warrior priest, practical tools for everyday life and understandings. Not going off to an ashram or sitting in a cave, but in the throes of everyday life. And that's the arena of what I call the peaceful warrior's way. And the sage, in his way, was a down to earth but also transcendent teacher, because he reminded me of things I had forgotten in my explorations of the sky of mind and the metaphysical worlds and possibilities. He brought me back down to earth by pointing out what we have more control over and less control over, and asking me where I wanted to spend my time and attention, uh, working on what I have less control over and never will have much control over, or what I have more control. In other words, most of us have grown up in a psychological culture assuming that to live wisely and well, or to reach some kind of illumination, we have to fix our insides. We have to have only positive thoughts or quiet mind. We have to have the right emotions like kindness and love and peace and happiness, and motivation and courage and confidence. And if we feel those things and find ways to generate those feelings, then we can live well. The sage turned all that on its head. He said and pointed out, nobody has to accept this as I say it now, as I didn't immediately accept it either. But he pointed out how we have very little direct control by our will over what emotions are passing through us in any given moment, or what thoughts are arising in our field of awareness, the random discursive mind. He said, wouldn't it be better to focus on what actually shapes our life, which is what we do, what we actually do, our actions, how we move our arms and legs, what we say and do. Speaking is an action as well. So my life has become much more simple in terms of just, what do I need to do now? That's the major question I have right now. What do I need to do in any given moment? What is my purpose? What is my goal? And then doing what needs to be done in line with that purpose.
Yeah, great. Well, you've written various books, of course, about purpose, including
Yes.
The Life You Were Born to Live and The Four Purposes of Life. And you've got a life purpose calculator on your website, thepeacefulwarrior.com, that people can look at if they want to get a few insights into their own purpose. And your magnus opus book, Dan, your website tells me, is your book, Everyday Enlightenment, which is the complete presentation of all your teachings, showing how to practice a more enlightened way of life. And while I imagine this book deals with practical advice for dealing with challenges in the arena of daily life, as you've described, I'm curious to know what your understanding of enlightenment is after a lifetime's travel towards this mountaintop, if we want to call it that. So what is enlightenment for you, Dan? And do you feel it's a relevant goal for people in the West to attain, or is an Eastern construct more suited to people raised within Eastern spiritual traditions?
Well, certain words like love and spirituality and enlightenment can be very tricky because they're interpreted
Yeah.
differently. And in the one of the first pages in the memoir, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, I defined several words: spiritual, wisdom, enlightenment, and God. And basically, spiritual is that which uplifts or inspires. Wisdom is perspective, realism, and understanding. Jimi Hendrix said it well. He said, knowledge speaks, but wisdom listens. And enlightenment, for me, is awakening to reality as it is, without all the projections, the extras, the associations, beliefs, projections, and opinions we project onto reality. And it's also a practice, but that's for another time. And finally, God is all that exists. As Muhammad said, wherever you turn is God's face.
Lovely. Thank you, Dan. Can you recommend one simple step or action that everyone can take following this call in the coming days to help them live a more enlightened life?
Well, since you raised the subject of this wonderful man, Aldous Huxley, who many people don't know and studied the global heritage of spiritual practices, when he was in hospice care, his friend Houston Smith, who literally wrote the book on world religions, asked Aldous, he said, Aldous, you've done all this study for all these years. Is there any way you can summarize all that you've learned? And Aldous said, I'm a little embarrassed to say, I can summarize it all in about 6 words. He said, try to be a little kinder. And maybe it all comes down to that, just practicing kindness whenever we can, to ourselves as well as to others.
I think that's brilliant advice, Dan. Yeah. I think, and it reminds me of something that the Dalai Lama once said, be wisely selfish, because the kinder and more compassionate we are to others, the more that comes back to us as well.
And if I can bring it home with a quote by Joseph Campbell,
Great.
I believe he said, maybe it's a paraphrasing, but he said, learn to go with joy among the sorrows of the world.
Lovely.
And what he meant by that sounds like he lacks compassion. How can you be joyous among the sorrows of the world? But, walking around with a long face and depressed and bending over, it doesn't help anybody. So we need to each bring what joy we can into the world, even with all its difficulties.
And that's something that the Dalai Lama seems to completely epitomize, isn't he? The sort of the constantly sort of cheerful face despite all the difficulties and challenges around him. Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant, Dan. Thank you. So your new book, Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit, is just out and it's available in all major bookstores and online outlets. Is there any way you'd recommend buying it from, or just from all those places that you normally get books from?
Well, for those, I love audiobooks. And for those who enjoy audiobooks, it's just, I narrated, and it was produced very beautifully by High Seraphim Audio, my daughter and her husband. And it's a very professional treatment of it. So there's the audiobook, there's the electronic book, and of course the print.
Great. And are there any particular courses or programs coming up that you'd like to let people know about?
One stop, if they want to check out, anybody can check out the free Life Purpose Calculator, read about my books and upcoming events and online courses at peacefulwarrior.com.
Brilliant. Dan Millman, thank you so much for sharing your journey, your wisdom and your truth. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you, and I wish you every success with Peaceful Heart, Warrior Spirit and its journey out into the world. Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed our conversation. Thank you, Will.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Follow Your Blisters, produced in association with Conscious Frontiers. I'd like to say a big, heartfelt thank you to Isaac Nichols for editing this podcast series, to Michael Tyak for the music, and to our wonderful partners, which include the trailblazing New Consciousness magazines, Resurgence and Ecologist, and Kindred Spirit, the UK's Frontier Restorative Festival, Medicine Festival, and here in Glastonbury, the vibrant Red Brick Community Enterprise Hub, and also GFM Radio, who've kindly lent us their recording studios. Finally, if you have any friends or family who you think would enjoy and benefit from this podcast, please do spread the word and send positive ripples out into the world. Thanks a million.